All right. Hey. All right. So, hey, Emily. So, welcome everyone. Another Friday night lecture. One of the more exciting parts of my job is to be able to introduce visiting artists, instructors, friends like Dan Thompson. So I want to give a quick intro about Dan, just for some of you that are not necessarily super familiar with Dan. So Dan is hard to kind of encapsulate in a short little intro, but sort of a living master, living legend, just incredible artist, incredible draftsman, painter, incredible teacher. In terms of his background, he was a co-founder of Grand Central Academy, co-founder of Janus Collaborative, which is where Chad studied, where Eddie studied. He's currently the chair of the CFA program at the New York Academy, been teaching in the MFA program at the New York Academy for 20 years. He's taught at the Art Students League for many years, the National Academy of Design, Parsons, just a total powerhouse and complete encyclopedia of anatomy, structure, everything, drawing, history, incredible. So for those of you that are here that are going to be taking his workshop this weekend, I'm jealous, very, very lucky, but we're all just incredibly honored to have you here tonight talking to us, so thanks so much, Dan.
Oh, sure, Jordan. Yeah, thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay? All right, awesome. When these kinds of introductions are done for me, they don't sound like me to me. That guy that you're describing sounds very accomplished. It can't be me. But thank you very much for being here, and for those of you in the workshop this weekend. I'm really excited about the class and excited about sharing some ideas on structure with you. So I thought we could geek out on some anatomy slides and some interesting things from art history and some nice quotes. So I prepared a talk for you specifically for this event. And so let's jump into it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll try to sound intelligent. I thought I would begin with a quote that I caught. I actually stole this from a great friend of mine, one of the greatest living teachers, in my opinion, John DeMartin. And John was interviewing his instructor, Michael Aviano, for his Patreon account. I have one as well, by the way. Hint, hint. And Michael said something wonderful. Michael Aviano, who many of you may know or may not know, was Frank Riley's monitor at the Art Students League. So a lot of our information that we're getting more and more into and more interested in exploring comes from the Frank Riley thought process about the preservation of structural thinking and anatomy, color theory, that sort of thing. If you don't know Frank Riley, then you probably will know Frank Riley pretty soon, because it's like a major DNA thread. If you've heard of Ted Seth Jacobs, then you have heard of Frank Riley indirectly, right, Jordan? So Michael Aviano, who was Riley's monitor, said, quote, "Our concepts of form are based on geometry," which I think is one of those little seeds of structure. When you're thinking about what structure is going to do for you, how it's going to enable your thinking, it's based on geometry, internal geometry. So please keep that in mind as we leaf through these slides. I've got some general things that I was cobbling together as I was preparing for this evening. Analyzing the human figure, I've got proportion and orientation. So when I say proportion, I'm referring to obviously the size, the scale of the human body. These images here kind of collated from Richer in his book. And it's interesting because taking the Richer book and comparing it to the Bridgeman book, as I did, they did kind of check out proportionally, which I didn't think would necessarily be the case. I mean, I thought Bridgeman was supposed to be drunk half the time. Isn't that the case? Yeah, they said he always came in inebriated. Sometimes he was so wasted his necktie was all the way over to one side, so they couldn't tell whether they should listen to him or not. But they check out. So the rib cage in this case is conceptualized as a 10-unit wide volume, as is the pelvis, and you can see they're lined up in that manner. So when you're thinking about the notion of proportion, that is an ideal. You know, that is definitely an ideal. You're not going to see proportion that way probably in anybody that you ever study perfectly. So you have to idealize it and turn it into something that works for you, that's fuel for your creative process. It's a requirement. So this is Cambiasso. I was sort of thinking about the idea of proportion and as well as the notion of orientation. Orientation to me is the notion of pulling back, pushing forward. We call that flexion and extension in the sagittal plane. When we pivot right side, left side, we call that lateral flexion in the coronal plane. And then there's the transverse plane. And you really have to begin to engage with these kinds of concepts, as you all know. But the people that are not necessarily creative types like us, the social rejects that we are not well aware of these ideas of orientation, nor are they aware of ideas of proportion. So people that have not reached the level that you have, and you're very accomplished in what you're doing from the work, it looks incredibly impressive. They're not aware of the fact that you have to idealize proportion, that you have to come to some kind of aesthetic solution in what you're choosing. So again, we have Cambiasso, and I think that block from Cambiasso, that beautiful, what do we call that, a butt block? Whatever that is. It shows up beautifully in the Raphael next to it in terms of the convincingness of the structure of the volume, even though we're not really getting to structure just yet. And I think that this is Mulready, who is just a neat draftsman, draws in red and black chalk together in a way that they're mixed and they're stumped. And like I said, the imagery is just fascinating. They're kind of in full light. They're very idealized. They're kind of 18th and 19th century aesthetic selections in my view. But this concept here of putting the ribcage and the pelvis in that arrangement, which I chose to annotate with the purple line, where I say the cartilages of the ribs 7 and 8, they are the moments of most anterior projection. That's part of, again, your ideal and what you have to decide upon when you assemble structure. I'm just getting started with this, so bear with me. And I love this Proudhon drawing because, and even though I've annotated this one as well, we also see that this individual is able to use the paper to such an extraordinary degree, and how, in this case, he articulates the positions of the shoulder, the way the shoulder pops out at us in space. And within that drawing, you can trust that there's tons of paper fiber that hasn't been treated, and which is kind of a minor miracle, They say don't use a ground unless you intend to utilize it, or don't select a ground unless you really use it. So you don't just cover up the ground. You make the ground work for you as a function of the modeling. Also, sort of picking out some territory to investigate with you. We've got the analyzing the figure in terms of perspective and construction. So I picked out this because, this is an anatomy plate from a medical atlas for medical students that I found in one of the medical schools that I was teaching in and organizing programming in Philadelphia. It's called Grant's Atlas. And I think we all agree that there's something missing here, right? I mean, what it has in information, and it's rich with information, there's something missing in terms of artistic appeal. And I would suggest that the missing component is the perspective. Why have the hand like that? Why can't you have the hand in a more artistic arrangement, a 3/4 or something along that line? I mean, that's my suggestion. I don't want to criticize the artist too much, but I do think there's something here that carves out our territory, our wheelhouse for where we think and think best. Isn't it weird when your phone starts ringing while you're doing a lecture? That always happens when I'm doing a lecture. My phone rings. Otherwise, it never rings. In terms of perspective, we have this idea of the great Dürer doing an incredible perspective plate and a reminder to us of the importance of the picture plane, of flattening out things as we look at the model and the form. But I think more in terms of practical application, we have this incredible McManus, the sculptor, who does something with perspective that is totally convincing, right? Completely convincing in the sense that you look up at the model and you really see the pivots in the head. You see the eye structure, the eye socket lifting up on our optical right side, correct? You do. And then on the lower left, I want to make sure this isn't in reverse. So the tool of perspective is quite important, as is the tool of structure. So again, I'm going to go back to an anatomical diagram which was made for doctors, and I'm going to suggest that the challenge of construction here is what's missing from this particular diagram. I see this as quite flat. I don't know if you do or not. And I'm also further I'm not fully aware as to whether making it three-dimensional was the intention, but it doesn't have that. So I want to shift over to a person who made a huge difference in my life, who I loved, and that was Dean Keller, Dean G. Keller, who was here, wherever you are, Dean. And he says in his book, construction and figure drawing is a practice which yields control and coherence of visual and anatomical references, what is seen and what is known. At each successive stage in the development of a drawing, care given to construction separates sketching from drawing. So that's a kind of intriguing, thought-provoking quote, isn't it? Because people say, well, when am I sketching, when am I drawing? And it isn't just the sketchbook, it's the sort of level of thought and the deeper engagement of the way you try to parse the issues in the figure, in the body. So, and then what is seen versus what is known is something that we return to. He's talking about the framework of construction. So I tried to organize these 4 initial suggestions to you of proportion, orientation, perspective, and construction in a Dean Keller drawing. So with me, orientation is suggested, at least initially, by the placement of the midline and the control of the midline, manipulation of the midline of the human body to denote rotation, to denote flexion, extension, that sort of thing. The green is the perspective and this perspectival indication in the figure, right? Because you have to put in these overlapping insights into the body. The proportion, you can see Dean does this thing. He was always holding the staff, which was amazing, and he would handle his business very matter-of-factly. He would say, question, how large is it? Answer. And he'd hold the staff up, and you'd sit there and just marvel at his composure, because he was halfway joking. I don't know what that is. That's his Dean. I guess that is Dean. But God love him. He was the best. There was nobody like him. And his notion of construction, I think, dovetailed pretty well into Kramer and into Goldstein, who talks about construction and structural lines as lines that are more anatomically centric. And of course, Dean discovered the drawings that were done by Bridgeman. And you know that story of how he discovered the drawings? Okay, some people don't know the story. All right, well, he was also a teacher at the Woodstock School of Art, and the reason why he taught at Woodstock was because his dad, Dean Keller Sr., as we sometimes called him, was a student at the Art Students League, as many of you know, of Bridgeman, but also the Woodstock School of Art was the summer school of the Art Students League. And so when Dumond came in, I think Dumond came in 1892 because he was a teacher of Hawthorne, and then Dumond checked out of the league for a while, and he taught at Woodstock. And then he returned to the league in 1906 and taught until 1951. So the Woodstock School was very affiliated with the Art Students League in its heyday when it had all the great people there. And so Dean is leaving one evening from his workshop, and a person that was doing maintenance says, I found some drawings. I'm throwing them away. They're in the dumpster, because they were in the dumpster. And not sure if they're worth anything, but you might want to check them out. And there were 50 4-by-8-foot drawings by Bridgeman. They were lecture drawings, 50 of them. I think some got cut up and turned into little small vignettes and whatnot. But we're so fortunate to listen to him, to go through the drawings and marvel at the drawings, because that was something that really added so much to the relic of it, you see, was having Dean Keller discover the drawings, unlike anybody else. Okay, so I've got more images for you, more things to say. I chose to pick out some imagery here that relates to our concerns and our interests that we've already kind of touched upon. Perspective, construction, proportion, that sort of thing. So this drawing from the Spanish Academy, I chose that because of Amaya, and it's sort of a beautiful arm. It makes you think about that. And I chose the one on the left side, which you probably haven't seen before, because a lot of us love Stephen Rogers Peck, and we don't really know that much about Stephen Rogers Peck's student work. So that's a student drawing by Stephen Rogers Peck's student at the Art Students League sometime around the 1940s. And you can see the influence of some of those insights in the drawing, right? With the red chalk and the convincing way that the corner of the body is articulated as we look at the pelvic region, for example. That, by the way, is Peck. Peck on the left and then Peck on the right as well. They were doing something along the lines of a movie about Stephen Rogers Peck, but that never came to fruition as far as I know. Pretty cool stuff, right? So when you combine these things with an artist that really is going after an aesthetic interpretation of anatomy, then you get someone like Charles Landseer in this incredible drawing of an écorché of a figure. You can get so much out of this, right? Just looking at it and marveling at it. It's certainly about the myology, the musculature, but it's also about the underlying form, that foundational, constructive form within that makes this really special. 1815. So to another quote, this one from John Sloan in The Gist of Art, he says, quote, he's probably recommending to a student or somebody like that, get the solid geometry of the form. So there's that word geometry again. Avoid doughy construction. I love the word doughy construction. It destroys measurements by which you realize the solid. You should know what a cross-section would look like. And so trying to assemble, a cohesive discussion for you this evening, I really touched upon that, that phrase cross-section resonated with me. And I was trying to figure out how, because we don't think as much about cross-sections as we probably should, how we could take a little bit more of an insight into cross-section. So much of what I'm going to talk about from here on out will involve different aspects of cross-section. I think you might find some of them rather interesting. The first is Peck again. This is Stephen Rogers Peck, who does this drawing manual that every art student, especially a figurative art student, knows about. But you can find the original manuscript at the New York Academy of Medicine, which is 103rd and 5th in Manhattan. And when you go and take a look at it, you see that just about all of his little annotation drawings have fallen off because they've been rubber cemented 50 years earlier into the pages. So that would be one of many different things that fell. But it's rich in cross-section, isn't it? That lovely way in which he perpendicularizes, if I can employ that as a verb, the bicep-tricep block versus the deltoid block versus the extensor and flexor mass of the forearm block versus the wrist block. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's some cross-sectional thinking. And that took me to this, which was, the one that we know and love from the great John H. Vanderpool from Chicago. Now I put 1904 in there because, as it turns out, Vanderpool actually begins his book as a series of magazine articles for a periodical for art students in 1904 in Chicago. And this is after he's been working on what Jessie Vanderpool, his wife, calls 30 years of research. She didn't call it 30 years of teaching, she called it 30 years of research. And the human figure was the result. It came out in 1907. And of course he dies of his third heart attack in 1911, so he didn't last long. But that's a very interesting cross-sectional diagram, and I want to dive into some of that with you this evening. Do you know that diagram? Most art students just flip through this and they're like, oh, that's kind of weird, that's kind of cool. But I've seen a lot of medical imaging, I've seen x-rays, so I don't pay too much attention to that. But I think it's fairly profound for 1907, 1904, as the case may be. In order to get there and be, let's say, a little bit more intrigued or enriched by this conversation, I thought we could touch on structural drawing. And I wanted to make a shout out to Francis D.K. Ching, who was the main structural draftsperson who we looked at Parsons School of Design, I think for good reason, back in the day. And I really love some of what he was creating in the sense that if you check out the chair, the one on the top right, I guess, there is a whole series of external, or I would say extrinsic cylinders that animate the form. And I think part of what makes structural drawing interesting is how that works, how you place those things in your mind's eye all over the place, in drapery, as we know, in other aspects, even with bone structure. But I got this Kramer quote, Kramer's book, I think I've got the official title somewhere in the slide talk, but he says, quote, "The simple geometric cylinder as an arm, while it may seem to be a reduction to the essentials of form, is in fact a complex and complete concept in itself. It has its own intact, finished character, and is therefore of limited adaptability." So I had to throw that in there because these things really make you think, right? And in some sense, what he says about limited adaptability in the cylinder is really thought-provoking, and I want to try to dig into it. So if you're trying to understand a shoulder, let's say, and you've got this notion that a shoulder is full of all these egg shapes or block shapes, you think of the acromion process, you think about the deltoid, you think about the twists and the converging bellies of the deltoid, maybe the cylinder is so plain and unambiguous that you can put all the mystery in the deltoid. Maybe that's what that's saying, or at least in part what that's saying. But I believe that most of the people that I've been working with over the last 25 years, when we look at structure, we tend to look at the blocks and the cylinders as quite adaptable. We don't see them as very rigid. And I think that's because we deconstruct them, right? We try to make really complex constructions of the human body based on geometric formulations. So I thought you'd enjoy that quote. I've got another one here for you as well. And here is the official, it's Human Anatomy and Figure Drawing in 1984 by Jack N. Kramer, which I started looking at a lot more after my friend Kurt Cowper suggested it, and I really appreciate that. He says, the principle of space structure, so there's another interesting phrase, space structure, is the visually measured location of height, width, and depth within a form. While easily grasped in theory, is widely ignored in practice, carelessly confused with light and shade, and lamentably misunderstood in the context of intricate human anatomy. Space structure. So, and we kind of understand that because we're so consumed and confounded by the light and shadow, it's really tough to separate our thinking from what's observed optically and what's thought of and, framed out as insightful thinking, as conceptual thinking. And for the longest time, the atelier and now academic system has had a difficult time kind of trying to separate those out and then recombine them to enable an artist to work toward their goals, toward their individual creative goals. The idea of flat versus 3D in a sense. But Kramer goes on, and this is a really interesting quote here. He says, difficult to discover in complex reality and generally concealed by artistic or expressive intent in drawing and painting, structure may be called the hidden language. I just love that quote, the hidden language. And I like the idea of a hidden language and structure because it's something that you can learn. A lot of people will come into class, they'll think, well, I just don't have a good color sense, or I can't see structure, I can't see 3D. Every time I walk down the street, I got to pull out Google Maps and figure out where I'm going. But to the idea or the thought that it is a language, it can be learned. And it also not only can be learned, but once you learn it at least a little bit, it can be improvised quite a bit. So we take a look at Bridgeman again and that amazing wheel that he builds out of the W shape of the ischia and the ilia. You know what I mean? It's like a locomotive or something. And then we look at Bomis on the right with this incredible looking vertebral column that twists in space. Reminds me of like a manatee or something. I'm not even sure, but there's something about the ingenuity and the imaginative nature of structure that, again, the artists in the room are really going to appreciate because people think that realism isn't all that creative, but it's incredibly creative. So another series of drawings come at us from a book which many of you probably already have, Sleep with It Under Your Pillow and all that, and this is Struttura. This is the Italian structure book. And I love that yellow plane, which is giving us the pivot on the pelvis, leaning forward. I think it's a kind of planar version of Neleton's line, linking the as-is to the ischial tuberosity in the back, the lower section. But this is the sort of thing that you can build with that language. Okay, so are we good so far? All right, good. Hope I'm not boring you. If so, don't say anything. Don't nod off. Next thing then is to start looking at some comparative diagrams. So this is the cross-sectional stuff. It struck me in going to the library again and again, quote, what a cross-section would look like from John Sloan. I would go to a text that you may have heard of by an artist you might have heard of. I'm not sure if you know this guy. But just in case you don't, his name is Durer. And his book is from 1528. 1528. And so we wind up in these amazing, this is all the way at the end of the book, and the book was published after he passed away, which is kind of wild. And so this is like what Vanderpoel was doing. This is a figure in cross-sectional thinking overlapped. Now this is kind of hard to read, isn't it? You could read the feet, obviously. But he's doing this in a way, and then he's breaking it down into these separate sections. And then what he does in his book, in terms of cross-sectional thinking, and remember that he's an avid, what I would call proportionalist. He's really thinking about the proportions of the body. But there is a fair amount, indeed a healthy amount of aestheticizing in these cross-sections, in what's being built. So do you see what I've done here? I've tried to annotate for you what's going on in the diagram. I've got 3 red lines to indicate the cross-sections in the body, straight out of Durer. And Durer's take on what those cross-sections would geometrically appear to resemble to you as you go into the right side. So we've got the shoulder, we've got essentially right around the waist. Isn't that neat? You see those kind of curvature structures? It's like a double curve on either side, separated by a midline. And then we go a little bit further down, and we've got another section there. So what I was thinking about was, why not put these in concert with Vanderpool and see what the two scions, who were great, they were not only great thinkers, they were like icons, geniuses that came before all of us. And so when I put these two together, these are just about approximately the same cross-section of the human body, one by Durer in 1528, another one by Vanderpool in 1904. I found that really interesting. And I started thinking, well, maybe I found it interesting because of the taper. It's different taper in one versus the other, which I really appreciate. This has to do with your notion, again, how you conceptualize the rib cage. Do you see it as a deeper form? Do you see it as a wider form? So we've got that. And once again, we start looking at the idea of not only the taper, but the concept of transitions from the front over to the side. And I think those have precedence themselves, because you look inside the body, at the internal dynamics of the body. This is not ambiguity either, right? This has to have some kind of substance, some kind of substantive way, so that when you shade and model, when you carve the form and you take the clay and you morph it, you don't hit no man's land when you move away from the midline. You have to have clarity of thought throughout. Good so far? All right, I think this is really cool. So another comparison here, roughly Vanderpool again, 1907, 1904, and then we've got Durer beneath him. And I thought this was kind of neat, that they're talking about a specific sort of taper in the back of the body that aligns itself with the scapula, and a specific kind of taper that likewise aligns itself with the front of the body in relation to the rib cage. And I just, I think that's wild. They had to come up with something, you have to come up with something, and I have to come up with something. But having their notes and what they configure the body to look like in a kind of cross-sectional geometry is fascinating. And so, not to be satisfied, we start looking at Richet, whose book Karina shared with me. And he does something very similar in the 19th century. He's cutting the body into these amazing cross-sections. So I thought, well, why not? Let's try it with Vanderpool and Richet and see what they come up with. And I think this is also really worth looking at, because this is your business. This is what you deal with in the human body. And so what do you see? You see a difference in the back quite a bit, don't you? You see a very big difference. And I think, and this is just guesswork on my part, but I believe that if anybody was doing dissection, it would be Richet. And if someone wasn't doing dissection, it would be Vanderpool. And so my theory on this, and it's just absolute, guesswork, is that Vanderpool idealized the position of the scapulae, which you see at the very top of the diagram, based upon, his concept of the body in space, being a master draftsperson, being a teacher and a researcher for 30 years, and it looks to me like there's a different positional dynamic going on with the scapula, which would have to do with a figure on a flat surface when you dissect it. I'll show you a single image related to this in a couple of seconds. But the other decisions, irrespective of what you're talking about in the back of the body, the other decisions about the degree of pivot with the breast form, because the breast form in many ways is analogous to the scapula because it doesn't go straight on. There's that famous quote we've all heard before that, one breast points toward Long Island City, the other one points toward, Governor's Island. And so we're talking about something that really has to give you a command over the three-quarter space in the body. And I think scapula and breast form are amazing for that. But look at how the tapers are different between Vanderpool on the left and Richet on the right. Richet seems to emanate more from the spinal column, which would seem to make sense from a Richet evaluative sense, and with Vanderpool it seems like he's thinking all the way through the body at all times. So elsewhere in a different section of the figure, we've got this, and we've got these two very divergent interpretations of the torso. I love the way that Vanderpool has so much geometry to it, and I'm not dissing Richet, But I do find that remarkable that we're kind of, I mean, they're pretty far apart in terms of their theory of what's going on, which probably is more a matter of getting these printed out or something like that and just going through them as you draw the figure, I would imagine, right? Additional, these are approximately the same section of the body. You see a very clear, again, very aestheticized version of the human body in Vanderpool. And then here they are again, with Richet on the right and Vanderpool on the left, helped by my annotation a little bit. But those subtle variations, where the thigh creeps forward, projects anteriorly from plan view versus the center of the pelvic mass is another interesting thing about it. All right, so when you go and apply this to the human body, my argument is a lot of us are going to be highly sensitized to the contour because we do that with shape. A lot of us are going to be very sensitive and we're going to acknowledge the clarity and the precision of the terminator, the edge between dark and light. But we need more information about what to look for in those in-between spaces. And that's why I'm talking about this, because I think having a little more substance here would help our industry tremendously. And not only that, but you could give yourself a better idea of how the ribs move so that when you're thinking about serratus anterior or pec minor or something like that, it isn't just sort of like maybe it's an egg space. There's a lot more to it than that some of these things can help you discern. So I posit the question, how, armed with the information about transitional form building, could you depict the cross-sections? Okay, a little bit more on the intrinsic geometry side. This was hung together. You know what happened was Vanderpool's entire book was borrowed by George Bridgman's brother and republished as an edition under Bridgeman Publications, and they sent it back in a leather-bound portfolio with a thank you letter. So there's a lot of respect paid between these two. I wanted to say in terms of Vanderpool, I know I say this a lot, but humor me for a second. There's something about the tapers in the body that's very structurally beneficial for you. Now I call this reverse taper, and you can see in terms of what I'm talking about that there's a sense when you look at the human body and you're staring at the rib cage that you can kind of see around the rib cage because of the way it's built. It's pretty wide in the back, somewhat narrow in the front, but not always the same, and it's the opposite in the pelvis. So when we talk about flare and taper and the fact that they reverse on the human figure and that they have to fit together, endlessly fascinating. The way it's built, the way you have to kind of transition something that's front taper all the way down, or sort of longitudinally, into a back taper form. People on Instagram are going, what the hell is this guy talking about? Anyway, it's my talk, so whatever. So then we have the idea of the octagonal planes, which are the transitional zones in the body. Again, these are areas that don't have to be ambiguous. These are sections of the human figure that are important to you in your dealings as an artist with a form, with your modeling of the form. Let's look at a few more here. And that takes us into some of these drawings that we might look at and identify as comprised of major forms and then comprised of smaller forms, what we sometimes refer to as subforms, subdivisions of form. And so you can see in the identification here on the left slide, I don't know why that's coming off the edge. It is, but that's by Dr. Wilhelm Braun, B-R-A-U-N-E, from 1888. Do you see that lower left side? I had a whole series of shots. This guy made a cross-sectional diagram of the human body from frozen cadavers in 1888 by hand and built out something that continued this research. So, when you're dealing with the subforms, I think, again, you're having to contend with how all of that small muscular anatomy and the build-out of it in terms of morphology changes your conception, changes what you're doing in the body. The block, the taper, various pieces, facets, changes in space, just tracing over what's already there in Vanderpool, and then taking away the slide. So we all have really been harping on the importance of getting a block working, but increasingly in the dialogues that I've been having with anatomical drawing and such, our aptitude is increasing. The students thankfully are getting better and better at what they're doing, what they're seeing, and so we're changing it up to 5-sided forms, 6-sided forms, 7-sided forms. And we're doing that because we're ready. We're ready to go. And we weren't ready before. Before we were just trying to get back into the vocation of seeing the figure and understanding the complexity of the human body. And again, one of the nice things about the academy model, it's not one person's way of doing things. You have a lot of really informed, insightful people helping other creative types. So I much prefer the academy and academic team of rivals model because of that. Because we all have failings creatively. We don't like to admit it, but it's good to come together and learn from each other. All right, so I take this, I try to assemble this into some sort of thing because I'm not very well versed in PowerPoint. I do the best I can, but this is what I put together. An eye looking at that cross-section. What would that look like? What would that seem to entail? And how could I further this concept for you? And it just seems a little bit ridiculous, but I was trying for this notion here because I love this Struttura Uomo image. You know what this is? This is it's like an origamist's version of a rib cage. And what they do is they're cutting the cross-section. You can see it near the bottom of the piece of paper, right? So it's cut straight through. So they really care about the cross-section that's going this way, as well as the first rib cross-section, which I can tell you is a variable. That is not an agreed-upon framework. And then look at that awesome curving structure that's somewhat reminiscent to the pelvis on the bottom of the rib cage. So they're trying to do that, and so I thought, let me trace that out. What I'm attempting to build has something to do with cutting the form right at that coronal plane. Does that make any sense, what I'm trying to do? It's a little strange, but I thought if I could put that together for you and I try to annotate it, that's about the best I can do. That having a command of those core cuts would really help you to almost make the architecture of the body much more realized. To give you a power that many just don't have because they don't really know how to go about the study of this. Okay, so there's my somewhat feeble attempt to try to incorporate some of these cuts into the diagram. But then I realized as I was looking at this and preparing for this evening that it was being done 495 years ago by Dürer. So there you go. Beat us to it. Which is really kind of amazing, isn't it? To be not only looking at the cross-sections, but trying to help artists combine the cross-sections with perspective so that they can understand a little bit more of the complexities of the body. I think that's really extraordinary. So long ago. So I continue doing, my stuff, and this is one of the pelvic drawings that I was working on for some students to try to organize blocky forms out of that core mass based upon landmarks. Almost like you could turn your brain into a pointing machine and find the landmarks in the human body and organize those points of reference. And of course try to additionally resource the skeleton, which I think is the best source for the structure. Another example here, trying to just get a better sense of that transitional area, moving away from the pubic tubercles, which are synonymous with the midline or the mid-corridor, as I sometimes call it. Interesting, in Vanderpoel's diagram, he doesn't really put in the block of the pelvis there. You see that? It's sort of cut in a tapered way. But that's sort of pre-structural thinking. Okay, and this is just me going a little nuts. Measuring, I know Chad has done some of this, measuring things out, measuring the proportions out, measuring the degrees of change out. That's another, I believe, aspect of idealizing. Don't assume that the relationship of the femoral head and neck is just the kind of thing you go with. Figure it out, because it could signal, as you go back to the previous image with me, it could signal something really important about those cones. At what angle do those cones pivot toward the front? Maybe do they cross in an X configuration or something like that? There's something really delightful about it because it's not only about figuring out the angles, it's figuring out the leverage on the body. In this case, it's the leverage essentially of iliopsoas, which we looked at in the cadaver room recently. And the way that iliopsoas uses the cone as a pivot point to flex the thigh, to bring the thigh forward. Without that cone, there is no iliopsoas doing anything, which is pretty awesome. So it's leverage based. More cross sections. I really had fun putting this together. But part of the issue that we also have to contend with is art is long and life is short. And we have to go and do a fair amount of reading and research, as well as a lot of work from the model, so that we're not always reinforcing bad habits. We're trying to make discoveries and get better so that we can improve exponentially as we go through the process of study. This is an example of just messing around, saying, how does Vanderpool bring the erectus spinae into the rectus abdominis in a kind of similarity of plane or similarity of form? Because they are sort of paired up, and we see them paired up in the Elliot Goldfinger text too, don't we? Some other cool stuff there, If you just trace on the lines and find a few things, I think you find some fascinating stuff, because as soon as you turn this example of the human figure, the female human figure in this case, to an upright position, so it's not plan view, it's upright, it makes you think, I don't see that as so pivoted in space. So when you're looking at the idea of making the tonal changes in the body, there could be some helpful things there. So let's see. I want to give you some of what I was talking about a second ago practically, but before I do that, I have to go into some more Kramer quotes, if you don't mind. He says, by far the most effective means, in my view, to achieve convincing foreshortening is the measurement of forms and spaces viewed as two-dimensionally. That is, measurement of a form by its silhouette and its related negative spaces. And we know that, we used a lot of that before. This compels a visual reduction of observed three-dimensional reality into a two-dimensional field consisting of height and width. It may be perceived as a flat, transparent plane, which forms have been reduced to flat shadow shapes surrounded by flat spaces, like a window with reality glued two-dimensionally to its outer side. It is directly pertinent to locational structure discussed in Chapter 1 and can culminate or can ultimately become an integral part of a unified structural vision. Again, really neat to see that written down in '84, because when I was a student in the 90s and having that notion floated to me of flattening out elements of space into a pretend total optical read. I don't want to sound redundant, so I don't want to say the word flat twice, but there's something about flattening out that we're taught to do as a matter of accuracy. And it's interesting because it does capture accuracy, but it also could potentially undermine our efforts structurally. It could turn the structural thinking on its head, because you don't necessarily want to challenge that idea of the flatness. It's a good example of where a wise decision strategically could be a terrible decision, the same one at a different time, in a process. So here was my application to modeling that I was going to touch upon here. So I've got this block, and so I thought I would attempt this. I build a block in, and I start looking at Vanderpool, and I'm referencing the 1904 diagram, so I'm just using his, so hope this makes sense. The next one is really important. As I put this together, I try to color code the orange plane on the left, you can see it, arrow to arrow, right? And I try to color code the blue plane on the right, arrow to arrow. So it's really going to matter how you chisel those planes in the human body. Because once you have them chiseled, once you have a concept of how there's an envelopment of the cross-section of the human figure, then I think you can conceptualize the light more effectively. Because you're thinking about the light has to really take in the form sense almost as a more preeminent concern, preoccupation than the light, in my view. So I go into this and I just shade it with my not too good digital skills. And so I'm laying light on top of a theoretical form that's attempting to be like what Vanderpool is doing in a very simple way, maybe too simple. But I thought this would be important because we're talking about utilizing some of the concepts. So light may go on the top of this and illuminate in a certain way, or you may place light in the front of it and illuminate differently, and you shouldn't have to chase the value. And if you work structurally and conceptually in a tactful manner, with great intrigue for the form, you won't have to do that. So back to some modeling. You can really see in the modeling scenarios, like some of the stuff that's done here, this amazing drawing from 1850, that they have that power, right? They really have that ability to flesh out the body in its heaviness. It's almost like a Lucian Freud pelvis. It's so beautiful. It's got such a confounding sense of volume. And I think that only comes from trying to really wrap your mind around. And that's why I am so inspired by the sculptors, because I think they've got the answer. So then in terms of looking, here's that shoulder again, looking at the morphology and trying to understand the morphological changes, a lot of that is going to come from this hidden language. This cross-sectional hidden language, this hidden language where you apply the forms that you would identify as useful. A different vocabulary, cone, block, rectangle, cylinder, sphere, egg. Those are your building blocks. And so we normally do this. Most often we're doing this as we try to conceptualize the form of the body changing in space. But it runs deeper too. You have shallow currents like this one, where we're really trying to resource the edges and synchronize and reconcile the forms within. From modeling factor to modeling factor, from contour to terminator, trying to understand how things work. And it also comes from playing around with all sorts of weird things like I would do. This is an attempt to pull together. It's a confluence of the cast, the Richer cast, struttura uomo, and a lot of annotation. Because it's weird how the view, and it just so happened in this case, the view that I had of the cast I took a photo of synchronized perfectly with the struttura uomo. And so the attempt goes into trying to understand how all that subtle surface form depiction can be conceived, because it is a great conceptual tool. So it's pretty cool, right? All right, other insights. This guy I just had to mention. He's so interesting. He's 1608. His name is Cousin, I think you pronounce it that way. And what he's doing is quite wild, but it gives you a sense of just how difficult this practice is. And Kramer mentions him in his book. He says several attempts have been made to create viable formal perspective systems for the general anatomy of the figure. And he says 1671, example from Jean Cousin below, but applied to complex organic forms like the human body or human image, the systems required an unwieldy, time-consuming perspective structure that discouraged their general adoption by artists. So it may be that they just didn't figure it out, because it was fairly early, right? But you gotta love the attempt. So he's looking at the different views, the top view, he's proportionalizing it, which is wonderful. It's straight up perspective, and the whole book is full of stuff like this, like flying angels. You gotta check this one out too. The legs, looking at the legs in space from the side, from the front, from the top. Again, this is what the sculptors do all the time, and it's also what the teacher does, because the teacher walks around the model all day long and gains an incredible insight, take it from me, from walking around the figure again and again. And then a few more Cousin. I like this one, but I love this one. It's just wild, But this is what we do. I mean, this is completely incomprehensible to those who don't do art, and those even who don't do figurative art. But to us, if you're not into this, you're in the wrong business, right? Because it's just fascinating to take a look at what they were doing. And then at the end of the Cousin book, he puts this in, which is pretty wild too. So he's going back to fundamental arcs and line segments and diagonals. He's using a lot of 45s. He's using a lot of perpendicular lines. He's using specific aspects of the circle and the arch, which I think are great. And then continuing the search for structural understanding. This is the part about my continuing pursuits here. And then I'll shut up and we can talk a bit more. If you have any questions. But this would be a different version of studying Vanderpool. And I've got an image here of my one-time teacher, Nelson Shanks. This is an early Shanks painting, but you can kind of read into the forms of the body on the right where those planes would be, can't you? You can kind of see the general topographical change in the figure, and that the artist had a great insight into how to figure that out, how to discern, or as Martha Erlbacher used to say, decode the figure. Decode. And I love the word decode because it alludes to the hidden language that Kramer mentions in his book. Next slide is, it's kind of embarrassing to put yourself in concert with Fetchin, but I tried it anyway. So this is my drawing on the right of the skull, and the reason why I couple this with Fetchin is because our continuing guidance system of the structural nature of the head's osteology and how that informs the way that we look at the depictions by great artists like Fetchin and the whole Russian school. And we had this tremendous argument, remember that? In class about this drawing. and everybody was talking about this idea that the structures didn't add up, that the blocks twisted. There was something wrong with the drawing, and it was a good thing it was virtual because no fisticuffs could break out. But there was a lot of contention in a great way, and I think we all agreed, at least it was my class, so I hope we all agreed, that it was a good thing that the structures didn't line up, that there was something about, again, taking command of the skill, where you suddenly twist or torque the cheek as opposed to the mouth. And I think that's what makes that drawing so magical, that he's able to go in there and almost, do a form of cubism in the head where he's twisting things up. I think Freud does that as well. In terms of the thing that I mentioned about structure and écorché, I continue to work on that sort of thing, but it's very important to me to conceptualize and to conceptualize effectively. So as opposed to building the form, I like to build the form with the books open as much as I can. All the books that I can find. The books that would give me different configurations of the clavicle, for example, different configurations of the leverage on pec minor. And then to take those forms and to methodically build them as life-size as possible so that they add up to a thing that can then be drawn, which is what I was doing in the drawing there, drawing from life and then drawing from the écorché. So there's a lot you can do in the écorché field. I'm super happy that you have a sculpture program here that's encouraging the thorough analysis of structural anatomy, because structural anatomy takes us into a kind of separate pocket of thought that's related to anatomy, but it's more aesthetic anatomy, it's more artistic anatomy. And I happen to believe artistic anatomy is one of your best friends as you study the forms of the body, because it's so creative and highly interpretive. Another example here, something I was working on in a class with some great friends in class. And what this is doing is it's making more of an exaggeration, more of a mannerist version of the bone structures of the wrist, which you can see up in the top left. How they bridge, the triquetral bridging between the lunate and the pisiform, and then how some of the distal row comes together to twist in space, and then how that might apply to a greater insight when you're drawing from a live setting, because sometimes in life drawing it's just hard to read. You've got the layers, you've got the veins and the vessels and nerves, as we call them. And so that continues to be an interesting thing. And then this is combining different versions of analyzing diagrams. So I'm studying Strutturo from top view. I'm studying the Richer from side view, trying to get a better sense of where things go. And these are fairly recent because I just stay in this world. It fascinates me. And I think that delving into this with the blocky constructions and the derivatives, the cones, the pyramids, continues to enrich my experience of the body because it's just so beautiful. The human figure is the most beautiful thing. So this was something I put together for some students, but this was more for me. This is an example of studying the region here, which I regard as quite elusive with an E, because it's so hard to figure out. The articulation is difficult because the art school skeletons don't give it to you. And then when you do have it, it's tough to line it up because, again, the arm doesn't just pop out of the side of the body, It comes out of the body in some ways perpendicular to the way that the hip comes out of the body. So it's a different animal. So just getting the articulation right is one of the reasons why we go to the cadaver room, to see things move as they should in space. And that, again, involves that hidden language, which we're looking for. The hidden language is the whole key. The hidden language governs all the decisions in the tone, and the hidden language is something that's constantly under evaluation so it can be improved. 2 more slides and then I'll shut up and take any questions you may have. The next slide here, a drawing of a model that was posing, and we were talking about the planar structure and the formulation of sort of planar topography in the body. Again, it's very much up for debate and a beautiful kind of thing to study because you get all these shifts going on and alternate interpretations of zygomatic, for example, and those can all be likened to a block with a fancy series of pivots related to it, like branching, almost like drawing trees or something. So those 2 views went together. And this is my last image. It comes again from the cadaver situation, going in and trying to be selective about the light and shadow so that when something is being modeled, for example, on the left, there's a deeper accent that sits near the bottom, not quite the bottom of scapula. We're really trying to use light and shadow to carve things out and make more of a clear record of what we're seeing. And I found that so interesting because in trying to teach the cadaver, the lighting is not artistic, you know. You just go in there and you see the lighting it's like a laboratory, it's like a doctor's office, so who can draw on that? But secondarily, if you can't rely on shape all that well anyway, you've got to use something else. So what we try to do in my class in this situation is put as many of the actual bony specimens next to the gift. We call them gifts because they are gifts, so that we can draw some manner of interpretive seeing out of the experience. It's more important that you build that framework in your head so that you can utilize that hidden language for future pursuits. Any questions? Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. Any questions about, I feel like I'm slouching down. From anybody about this stuff? Did you dig the talk? Yeah. Okay, great. Those Dürer images are amazing, right? And having him think about that in 1528 is amazing. So no, we're good? Any questions from the audience and Instagram? Yeah, go ahead. Thomas. Oh, it's because we have this thing in the study of the human frame and human form called modulating asymmetry. It's one of my favorite things, modulating asymmetry. What does it mean? It means that nothing truly lines up. You know, when you look at somebody in a social context, you start to really study their face, and you realize that this element's a bit higher than that element. And so if you were to line everything up perfectly, it wouldn't look like them. It would have this strange, almost anamorphic sort of uncanny valley effect. And so when you see it exaggerated in certain examples, you get a lot more character because facial expression is somehow a kind of equivalent to gesture drawing, in my view. And so having some misalignment and twists in the face gives a lot more of the individual, and I think gives you power of expression in ways that we sometimes don't allow ourselves to indulge in because we're so phobic about getting the perspective right, you know, getting the structure to work, and we've been told that, you know, the eye level determines this and that, but at the end of the experience, if you've selected well and gotten things established in the blocky framework at your eye level, then I think you should take some poetic, you know, departures from that and see what it gives. Good. Anything else? No questions from the Instagram audience? Just Z's? No middle fingers though, I hope, right? Okay, good. They're not for me, they're for you. Yes? I think it's really important to work from cadavers now because the situation is that we go to the body and we look with our eyes in the physical space with the model, and we have a series of books that tell us what we're supposed to see. And the books are, in many ways, quite profound. And they're like unique time capsules into an aesthetic that someone like Richer would proclaim we're supposed to adopt. You know, like the body is this set of heads, you know, that kind of thing. And some of those aesthetics have never been equaled, have never been improved upon, because Richer is amazing. And other parts, maybe they're up for debate, they're up for, you know, revision, or something like that. So when you go to the cadaver, it's your way of really of going to the source, of bypassing the texts, which are sometimes the templates or the symbols which invade your thinking, and somehow shut your perception down in a way that you don't want it to shut down. So if you study the books a lot, and then go to the cadaver, you're oftentimes much more enriched by the experience and well-informed enough to say, you know, things like, well, that's inadequate, you know, that particular form, that triquetral in Grant just doesn't make any sense, so I'm not going to abide by that. Or this thing is amazing in this book. And so you kind of pull together your research in a way that invigorates your thinking and constantly keeps you in this mode of thought when you're drawing or painting, where it's just the thrill of a lifetime. because I think that's our obligation. We have to maintain this thrilling aspect of studying art and design. If we don't do that, if we kind of bury ourselves in self-criticism and work and constantly do that to ourselves, it's going to turn negative. It's going to feel less and less inviting. And one of the things the research does, and the cadaver does as well, is it keeps that kind of excitement level of discovery alive and well. So, yeah.
On that topic, when you mentioned about the shoulder, can you explain a bit more about how it doesn't match up from our skeleton models?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Vesalius is the first one to create an articulated skeleton. So Vesalius out of Padua, in his incredible book from the 16th century. And it's amazing to think that people have been running around, doing things like medical practice without an articulated skeleton until Vesalius comes along. And evidently, his articulated skeleton is still in existence, which is just incredible. But when you look at the articulated skeleton now, especially the plastic one, there are all sorts of misaligned forms because the distances are off. So we're taught that, like almost all of the shoulders are dislocated according to the standards of observational phenomenon in front of us in the life model, on the stand. And so what I think we really need to do is to revisit that so that we can get the proper articulation of the bone structures. All those introvertible discs that separate the spinal column so much that we get a sense that there's like a mile of distance between the forms of rib cage and pelvis. And then when we walk in the model room, we draw that into the model. We got to get away from that. And I think we could do that if we get some better articulated specimens, in my view. There's another thing. When you teach it a lot, you see these things, but the patella, and this may be a little thing and kind of a gripe, I hope it isn't, but the patella is now it's screwed into the femur, and as if it goes with the femur, and it really doesn't go with the femur, it goes with the tibia. And in the older skeletons, they tended to go with the tibia, so the hardware was different. So it's stuff like that. Yes?
Just thinking about ideals and how we had different cultures at different times. There's been different idealizations of the form, what culturally is most wanted. Do you think that has affected how we have different tailors, shapes, and stuff? Do you think that affected how the artists thought about the idealized form as it was cross sections in different time periods?
I think it has, yeah. I'm not an art historian, but I think that you take someone like Caravaggio who vastly changes things and affects the Caravaggisti that follow that artist. And that's, in many ways, it's a kind of a dynamic of light and dark that does it in that instance. But I think there are many examples of that. What I do know is what affects me, and what you know is what affects you. And one of the great things about the conversation that we can have is we have all of this history to look back on, aesthetic history. It's not so much the birth dates, the big commissions and all that kind of stuff. It's the aesthetic accomplishments where we can be very self-selective and say, that concept really works for me, or that one doesn't. We do that in some circles with the French school. My colleague John de Martin is amazingly, he's pro-French 18th century, and I've learned a ton from looking at that musculature more carefully. So Jacques-Louis David's aesthetic, totally different than, Andrea del Sarto, but, just as enriching because it gives you different ways of moving forward. It's like if you were a guitar player and you went around and listened to all these amazing musicians play guitar, you'd have different senses of pitch harmonics and the way that they would move the sound in their unique way. So it's great to be able to talk about that now, and especially in the context of this amazing school, which is like, I remember the previous version, and the second coming is something to see, something to really, be excited about. And to do this in the context where there's no shame involved in looking at representational drawing anymore, or painting. It's something to be really excited about. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Anybody else have a question?
There's a question from Instagram.
Yes.
When do you think is the best time to incorporate sculpture in a painter's training?
early on and constantly, because if it's early on, then there's already a mode of three-dimensional, sort of cognitive thinking in a nascent stage, so that when a person is, this is one of my things that I believe in highly, which is gestures three-dimensional, gesture drawing. It's a little strange to think of a three-dimensional movement in space, but it really is 3D because they have to balance their weight, forward, backward, it projects, it recedes, and they're an entire system of weighted forms in space. But if you've got that and you're also sculpting gesturally, short pose, if you don't know a thing about clay, but you just get in there and start trying to understand how the body moves this way as opposed to moves that way, then that will be, I think, an immense boost to your training. And then when it comes to the ideas of forms that are foreshortened in the head and in the body, for example, zygomatic, when you sculpt that form and you put your hands on it and you can feel it turn in space, you're much more enabled to be able to not only get it right when you see it in the model, but be, again, quite selective in a design sense, where you're constructing it because you felt it, because you have a tactile agenda for it, which is a good thing. So I do a lot of it if I were them. And then, of course, écorché, right? Three-dimensional, reverse dissection, which is what it is. Yes? I thought the quota was one question, Thomas. No? I thought I read that in the student handbook, no? All right, go ahead.
In your work, you're balancing on this line of heavy scaffolding, heavy architecture, like you show everything. You show so much in this structure, yet there's also this pressure. Like you can hold on to the naturalism of what's being seen. In implementing what is seen and what is known,
Mm-hmm.
Keller quote, for you, what determines that it's not necessary to see people what we are in the process to be we can choose where to inject what we know, what to interpret what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's kind of the kind of question that you dedicate yourself to discovering the answer to over a lifetime. And I would say a couple things that come to mind initially. The first is my, justified obsession with bone structure would help a great deal, because bone structure is one of the most complicated and I think maybe presumptuous things. We look a lot at the musculature and we think about the functionality, and we should, but the muscles are nothing without this complex geometry that underlies them, which is always changing. The entire body is shifting. And then when you go to the cadaver room and we open up the proverbial drawer of 100 humeruses, every single one of them is different, which is just incredible too. But the other part of my answer would be this. I'm thinking about this quote that I heard from Dickinson, Edwin Dickinson, where he said, "Seeing is adding thought to vision." And so the idea of seeing doesn't necessarily relegate that information to the optical. It doesn't necessarily mean that the seeing part is the flat part. It doesn't mandate that the seeing part is the reception of what's going on up there. What it implies, I believe, is that the seeing is both an observational and a cognitive function, and that when you see, like I just made the statement about tactile. I think I might have used tactile seeing, but tactile seeing would be a sculptor's ability to go in and see the surface topography in their mind, in her or his mind, as they look at the form of the body. And that kind of seeing is definitely not a sort of looking. It's a more contemplative practice, a profound practice. So, what is seen and what is known is, what is known is also what is presumed, and you're going to add to what's known by the work that you do, every single one of you. As you make discoveries and teach your students, you're going to add your voice to their training, and what is known is going to change. So that's pretty cool too. Like the way we read Richer these days, totally different than the way we used to read it even 20 years ago. So, all right. All right, good. Thank you so much for listening. Appreciate you being here. All right.